The Works of President Jonathan Edwards, Volume 1, Chapter 3. His General Deportment, particularly while at Northampton. In the first chapter of these memoirs, we have seen that Mr. Edwards, having taken his master's degree, was very soon invited to be tutor of that college where he received his education, and which conferred upon him that degree, a clear proof that the managers had a high opinion of his talents and qualifications, when only in the 21st year of his age. It must be owned that this was an engagement of great consequence for so young a man, especially considering that no small portion of his time had been devoted to ministerial occupations and the requisite preparatory studies which relate exclusively to that important business. But the strength of his mind overcame difficulties which to the generality of students appeared insuperable. It must be allowed indeed that our author was not in the highest class of learned men, for his time, his means, and his duties did not allow of such an attainment. We should recollect, however, that Mr. Locke somewhere very properly observes that though men of much reading are greatly learned, yet they may be but little knowing. In some situations and circumstances he might have been a great linguist, a profound mathematician, a distinguished natural philosopher, but without any designated reflection on those who excel in these or any other branches of literature and science, he was far more happily employed both for himself and others. In fact, he has given proofs of a mind so uncommonly vigorous and enlightened that it is rather a matter of joy it was not engrossed by studies which would have rendered him only the admiration of a few, but prevented him from producing those works which are of universal importance, and in which he appears as the instructor of all. He had, in short, the best and sublimest kind of knowledge, without being too much encumbered with what was but little compatible with his calling. We have also seen that Mr. Edwards resigned his tutorship at Yale College when he had been there in that capacity a little more than 2 years, in consequence of an invitation from Northampton in Massachusetts, in order to assist the aged and venerable Mr. Stoddard. In the present chapter we propose to detail his general manner of life more particularly while at this place, which, in connection with the uncommon revival of religion there, of which he was the happy and honored instrument, is a very interesting period of his life. He who enters into the true spirit of our author's writings, and especially of the extracts we have given from his private papers, cannot question that he made conscience of private devotion, but, as he made a secret of such exercises, nothing can be said of them but what his papers discover, and what may be fairly inferred from circumstances. It appears by his diary that in his youth he determined to attend secret prayer more than twice a day, when circumstances would allow, and there is much evidence that he was frequent and punctual in that duty, often kept days of fasting and prayer, and set apart portions of time for devout meditations on spiritual and eternal things as part of his religious exercises in retirement. This constant, solemn converse with God in these exercises made his face, as it were, to shine before others. His appearance, his countenance, words, and whole demeanor, though without anything of affected grimace or sour austerity, were attended with a seriousness, gravity, and solemnity, which were the genuine indication of a deep abiding sense of divine things on his mind, and of living constantly in the fear of God. Agreeably to his resolutions, he was very careful, abstemious in eating and drinking, as doubtless it was necessary for so great a student, and a person of so delicate a make as he was, in order to be comfortable and useful. When he had, by careful observation, found what kind and what quality of diet best suited his constitution, and rendered him most fit to pursue his work, he was very strict and exact in complying with it. In this respect he lived by rule, and herein he constantly practiced great self-denial, which he also did in his constant early rising in order to redeem time for study. He accustomed himself to rise at 4 or between 4 and 5 in the morning. Though he was of a tender constitution, yet few students are capable of more close application or for more hours in a day than he was. He commonly spent 13 hours every day in his study. His most usual diversion in summer was riding on horseback and walking. He would commonly, unless diverted by company, ride 2 or 3 miles after dinner to some lonely grove where he would dismount and walk a while, at which time he generally carried his pen and ink with him to note any thought that might be suggested and which promised some light on any important subject. In the winter he was wont, almost daily, to take an axe and chop wood moderately for the space of half an hour or more. He had an uncommon thirst for knowledge, in the pursuit of which he spared no cost nor pains. He read all the books, especially books on divinity, that he could come at, from which he could hope to get any help in his pursuit of knowledge. And in this he did not confine himself to authors of any particular sect or denomination, but even took much pains to come at the books of the most noted writers who advanced a scheme of divinity most contrary to his own principles. But he studied the Bible more than any other books and more than most other divines do. His uncommon acquaintancy with the Bible appears in his sermons and in most of his publications, and his great pains in studying it are manifest in his manuscript notes upon it, of which a more particular account will be given hereafter. He took his religious principles from the Bible and not from any human system or body of divinity. Though his principles were Calvinistic, yet he called no man father. He thought and judged for himself, and was truly very much of an original. Reading was not the only method he took to improve his mind. He was much given to writing, without which, probably, no student can make improvements to the best advantage. Agreeably to Resolution 11th, he applied himself with all his might to find out the truth. He searched for understanding and knowledge as for silver, and digged for it as for hid treasures. Every thought on any subject which appeared to him worth pursuing and preserving, he pursued as far as he then could with a pen in his hand. Thus he was all his days, like the busy bee, collecting from every opening flower and storing up a stock of knowledge, which was indeed sweet to him as the honey in the honeycomb. And, as he advanced in years and in knowledge, his pen was more and more employed, and his manuscripts grew much faster on his hands. He was thought by some who had but a slight acquaintancy with him to be stiff and unsociable, but this was owing to the want of better acquaintancy. He was not a man of many words indeed, and was somewhat reserved among strangers, and those on whose candor and friendship he did not know he could rely. And this was probably owing to 2 things. First, the strict guard he set over his tongue from his youth, which appears by his resolutions, taking great care never to use it in any way that might prove mischievous to any, never to sin with his tongue, nor to employ it in idle, trivial, and impertinent talk, which generally makes up a great part of the conversation of those who are full of words in all companies. He was sensible that in the multitude of words there wanted not sin, and therefore refrained his lips, and habituated himself to think before he spoke, and to propose some good end even in all his words, which led him to be, above others, conformable to an apostolical precept, slow to speak. Secondly, this was in part the effect of his bodily constitution. He possessed but a comparatively small stock of animal life. His spirits were low, and he had not strength of lungs to spare that would be necessary in order to make him what might be called an indefatigable fascist gentleman. They who have a great flow of animal spirits and so can speak with less expense than others may doubtless lawfully practice free conversation in all companies for a lower end, an example, to please or to render themselves acceptable, but not so he who has not such a stock. It becomes him to reserve what he has for higher and more important service. Besides, the want of animal spirits lies a man under a natural inability of exercising that freedom of conversation which those of more life naturally glide into, and the greatest degree of a sociable disposition, humility, and benevolence will not remove this obstacle. He was not forward to enter into any dispute among strangers, and in companies where there might be persons of different sentiments, being sensible that such disputes are generally unprofitable and often sinful and of bad consequence, he thought he could dispute to the best advantage with his pen. Yet he was always free to give his sentiments on any subject proposed to him, and to remove any difficulties or objections offered by way of inquiry as lying in the way of what he looked upon to be the truth. But how groundless the imputation of stiff and unsociable was, his known and tried friends best knew. They always found him easy of access, kind and condescending, and though not talkative, yet affable and free. Among such whose candor and friendship he had experience, he threw off reserve, and was quite patient of contradiction, while the utmost opposition was made of his sentiments that could be by any plausible arguments or objections. And indeed he was, on all occasions, quite sociable and free with all who had any special business with him. In his family he practiced the conscious exactness which was conspicuous in all his ways. He maintained a great esteem and regard for his amiable and excellent consort. Much of the tender and kind was expressed in his conversation with her and conducted towards her. He was wont frequently to converse freely with her on matters of religion, and he used commonly to pray with her in his study at least once a day, unless something extraordinary prevented. The time for this commonly was just before going to bed, after prayers in the family. As he rose very early himself, he was wont to have his family up betimes in the morning, after which, before they entered on the business of the day, he attended on family prayers. When a chapter in the Bible was read, commonly by candlelight in the winter, upon which he asked his children questions concerning, according to their age and capacity, and took occasion to explain some passages in it, or enforce any duty recommended, an example, as he thought most proper. And he was thorough in his government of his children, and as a consequence of this, they revered, esteemed, and loved him. He took special care to begin his government of them in good time. When they first discovered any considerable degree of self-will and stubbornness, he would attend to them till he had thoroughly subdued them and brought them to submit. Such prudent discipline, exercised with the greatest calmness, being repeated once or twice, was generally sufficient for that child, and effectually established his parental authority and produced a cheerful obedience ever after. He kept a watchful eye over his children, that he might admonish them of the first wrong step and direct them in the right way. He took opportunities to converse with them in his study, singly and closely, about their soul's concerns, and to give them warning, exhortation, and direction as he saw need. He took much pains to instruct them in the principles of religion, in which he made use of the Assembly's shorter catechism, not merely by taking care that they learned it by heart, but by leading them into an understanding of the doctrines therein taught, by asking them questions of each answer and explaining it to them. His usual time to attend to this was on the evening before the Sabbath, and as he believed that the Sabbath or holy time began at sunset, the evening before the day, he ordered his family to finish all their secular business by that time or before. When all were called together, a psalm was sung and prayer made as an introduction to the sanctification of the Sabbath. This care and exactness effectually prevented that intruding on holy time by attending to secular business, which is too common even in families where the evening before the Sabbath is pretended to be observed. He was a great enemy to young people's unseasonable associating together for vain amusements, which he regarded as a dangerous step towards corrupting and bringing them to ruin. And he thought the excuse many parents made for tolerating their children in it, viz., that it is the custom and other children practice it, which render it difficult and even impossible to restrain their errors, was insufficient and frivolous, and manifested a great degree of stupidity on supposition the practice was hurtful and pernicious to their souls. And when his children grew up, he found no difficulty in restraining them from this pernicious practice, but they cheerfully complied with the will of their parents. He allowed none of his children to be from home after 9 o'clock at night, when they went abroad to see their friends and companions. Neither were they allowed to set up much after that time in his own house, when any came to make them a visit. If any gentleman desired acquaintancy with his daughters, after handsomely introducing himself by properly consulting the parents, he was allowed all proper opportunity for it, but must not intrude on the proper hours of rest and sleep, nor the religion and order of the family. He had a strict and inviolable regard to justice in all his dealings with his neighbors, and was very careful to provide things honest in the sight of all men, so that scarcely a man had any dealings with him that was not satisfied of his uprightness. He appeared to have a sacred regard to truth in his words, both in promises and narration, agreeable to his resolutions. This doubtless was one reason why he was not so full of words as many are. No man feared to rely on his veracity. He was cautious in choosing his intimate friends, and therefore he had not many that might properly be called such, but to them he showed himself friendly in a peculiar manner. He was indeed a faithful friend, and able above most others to keep a secret. To them he discovered himself more than to others, led them into his views and ends, and to his conduct in particular instances, by which they had abundant evidence that he well understood human nature, and that his general reservedness and many particular instances of his conduct, which a stranger might impute to ignorancy of men, were really owing to his uncommon knowledge of mankind. His conversation with his friends was always profitable. He was not wont to spend his time with them in scandal and backbiting, or in foolish jesting, idle chat, and telling stories. But his mouth was that of the just, which bringeth forth wisdom, and whose lips dispense knowledge. His tongue was as the pen of a ready writer, while he conversed about the important heavenly divine things, which his heart was so full of, in such a natural and free manner, as to be most entertaining and instructive, so that none of his friends could enjoy his company without instruction and profit, unless it was by their own fault. His great benevolence to mankind discovered itself, among other ways, by the uncommon regard he showed to the poor and distressed. He was much in recommending charity both in his public discourses and private conversations. He often declared it to be his opinion that professed Christians in these days are greatly deficient in this duty, and much more so than in most other parts of external Christianity. He often observed how much this is spoken of, recommended, and encouraged in the Holy Scripture, especially in the New Testament. And it was his opinion that every particular church ought by frequent and liberal contribution to maintain a public stock that might be ready for the poor and necessitous members of the church, and that the principal business of deacons is to take care of the poor and the faithful and judicious distribution and improvement of the church's temporals lodged in their hands. And he did not content himself with recommending charity to others, but practiced it much himself. He was forward to give on all public occasions of charity, though when it could properly be done, he always concealed the sum given, and some instances of his giving more privately have accidentally come to the knowledge of others, in which his liberality appeared in a very extraordinary degree. One of the instances was this. Upon his hearing that a poor obscure man, whom he never saw, or any of his kindred, was by an extraordinary bodily disorder brought to great straits, he, unasked, gave a considerable sum to a friend to be delivered to the distressed person, having first required a promise of him that he would let neither the person who was the object of his charity nor anyone else know by whom it was given. This may serve both as an instance of his extraordinary charity and of his great care to conceal it. Footnote: as both the giver and the object of his charity are dead, and all the ends of the proposed secrecy are answered, it is thought not inconsistent with the above-mentioned promise to make known the fact as it is here related. End of footnote. Mr. Evarts had the character of a good preacher, almost beyond any minister in America. His eminency as a preacher seems to have been owing to the following things. First, the great pains he took in composing his sermons, especially in the first part of his life, as by his early rising and constant attention to study, he had more time than most others, so he spent more time in making the sermons. He wrote most of them in full, or near 20 years after he first began to preach, though he did not wholly confine himself to his paper in delivering them. Secondly, his great acquaintance with divinity and knowledge of the Bible. His extensive knowledge and great clearness of thought enabled him to handle every subject with great judgment and propriety, and to bring out of his treasure things new and old. Every subject he handled was instructive, plain, entertaining, and profitable, which was much owing to his being master of the subject and his great skill to treat it in a most natural, easy, and profitable manner. None of his composures were dry speculations, unmeaning haranguings, or words without ideas. When he dealt on those truths which are most converted and opposed by many, which was often the case, he would set them in such a natural and easy light, and every sentiment from step to step, would drop from his lips, attached with such clear and striking evidence, both from Scripture and reason, as even to force the absence of every attentive hearer. Thirdly, his excellency as a preacher was very much the effect of his great acquaintance with his own heart, his inward sense and high relish of divine truths and experimental religion, degree of inward fever, without much noise or gesture, and fell with great weight on the minds of his hearers. Though he was wont to read what he delivered, he was far from thinking this the best way of preaching in general, and looked upon his using notes so much as he did a defect and infirmity. And in the latter part of his life he was inclined to think it had been better if he had never accustomed himself to using notes at all. It appeared to him that preaching wholly without notes, agreeably to the custom in most Protestant countries, and what seems evidently to have been the manner of the apostles and primitive ministers of the gospel, was the most natural way, and had the greatest tendency, on the whole, to answer the end of preaching. And suppose that none who had talents equal to the work of the ministry was incapable of speaking memorial, if he took suitable pains for this attainment from his youth. He would have the young preacher write his sermons, at least most of them, out at large, and instead of reading them to his hearers, take pains to commit them to memory, which, though it would require a great deal of labor at first, yet would soon become easier to use and help him to speak more correctly and freely, and be of great service to him all his days. His prayers were indeed exemplary. He was the farthest from any appearance of a form as to his words and manner of expression of almost any man. He was quite singular and immutable in this, in any who have not a spirit of real and dissembled devotion, yet he always expressed himself with decency and propriety. He appeared to have much of the grace and spirit of prayer, to pray with the spirit and with the understanding, and to perform this part of duty much to the acceptance and edification of those who joined with him. He was not wont, in ordinary cases, to be long in his prayers, an error which he observed was often hurtful to public and social prayer, as it tends rather to damp than to promote true devotion. He gave himself together to the work of the ministry, and entangled not himself with the affairs of this life. He left the particular oversight and direction of the temporal concerns of his family almost entirely to Mrs. Edwards. He was less acquainted with most of his temporal affairs than many of his neighbors, and seldom knew when and by whom his forage for winter was gathered in, or how many milk kins he had, or whence his table was furnished, etc. He did not make it his custom to visit his people in their own houses, unless he was sent for by the sick, or he heard that they were under some special affliction. Instead of visiting from house to house, he used to preach frequently at private meetings in particular neighborhoods, and often called the young people and children to his own house, when he used to pray with them and treat them in a manner suited to the years and circumstances. And he catechismed the children in public every Sabbath in the summer. And he used sometimes to pose questions to particular young persons in writing, for them to answer after a proper time given them to prepare. In putting out these questions, he endeavored to suit them to the age, genius, and abilities of those to whom they were given. His questions were generally such as required but a short answer, and yet could not be answered without a particular knowledge of some historical part of the Scripture, and therefore led and even obliged persons to study the Bible. He did not neglect visiting his people from house to house, because he did not look upon it in ordinary cases to be one part of the work of a gospel minister, but because he supposed that ministers should, with respect to this, consult their own talents and circumstances, and visit more or less according to the degree in which they could hope thereby to promote the great ends of the ministry. He observed that some had a talent for entertaining and profiting by occasional visits among their people. He supposed such had a call to spend a great deal of their time in visiting their people, but he looked on his own talents to be quite otherwise. He was not able to enter into a free conversation with every person he met, and in an easy manner turn it to what topic he pleased, without the help of others, and it may be against their inclination. He therefore found that his visit of this kind must be in a great degree unprofitable. It appeared to him that he could do the greatest good to souls, and most promote the interests of Christ by preaching and writing and conversing with persons under religious impressions in his study, whether he encouraged all such to repair, where they might be sure in ordinary cases to find him and be allowed easy access to him, and where they were treated with all desirable tenderness, kindness, and familiarity. In times, therefore, of the revival of religion among his people, his study was strong with persons who came to lay open their spiritual concerns to him and seek his advice and direction. These he received with great freedom and pleasure, and there he had the best opportunity to deal in the most particular manner with each one. He was a skillful guide to souls under spiritual difficulties, and was therefore sought unto not only by his own people, but by many who lived scores of miles off. He became such partly by his own experimental acquaintancy with divine things and unwearied study of God's Word, and partly by his having so much concern for souls under spiritual troubles. For he had not been settled in the work of the ministry many years before the Spirit of God was wonderfully poured out on his people, by which a great concern about their souls became almost universal, and a great number were hopefully the subjects of saving conversion. There was a very remarkable outpouring of God's Holy Spirit in this part of America in the years 1740 and 1741, and in which Northampton largely partook. Mr. Edwards at this time had to deal not only with his own people, but with multitudes of others. The report that the same things were at Northampton some years before, and Mr. Edwards' fame for knowledge, piety, and great acquaintancy with experimental religion naturally led both ministers and people from almost all parts of New England to look to him for directions and assistance in this extraordinary time. Being earnestly solicited by ministers and people to come and preach among them, he went to many, though he was not able to gratify all who desired him, and his preaching was attended with great success. As many of the ministers and people in New England had been acquainted with such things, they were greatly exposed to run wild, and, by the subtle temptation of the devil, actually did go into great extremes, both as opposers and friends to the work of God. Mr. Edwards was greatly helpful by his direction and assistance against the two opposite extremes in conversation, preaching, and writing. His publications on this occasion were of great and extensive service, especially a sermon preached in North Haven, September 10, 1741, on Distinguishing Marks of a Work of the Spirit of God, etc. His thoughts concerning the present revival of religion in New England, etc., and his treatise on religious affections, all which might be justly considered by the Church of Christ as a wise and friendly voice behind him, saying, "This is the way, walk therein," especially the last mentioned treatise, which has been esteemed by many the best that has been written on that subject, setting the distinction between true and false religion in the most clear and striking light. And to the same purpose is the life of the Reverend David Brennard, with reflections and observations, published by Mr. Edwards in 1749. Mr. Edwards was what some would call a rigid Calvinist. Those doctrines of Calvinists which have been most objected against and given the greatest offense appeared to him scriptural, reasonable, and important, and he thought that to give them up was in effect to give up all. He therefore looked upon those who, calling themselves Calvinists, were for softening down the truth, that they might conform it more to the taste of those who are most disposed to object against it, were really betraying the cause they pretended to espouse, and were paving the way not only for Arminianism, but to deism. For if these doctrines were down with consistency short of deism, or even atheism itself, or rather universal skepticism, he judged that nothing was wanting but to have these doctrines properly stated and judiciously defended, in order to their appearing most agreeably to reason and common sense, as well as doctrines of revelation, and that this therefore was the only effectual method to convince or silence or put to shame the opposers of them. All will be able to satisfy themselves of the truth of this by reading his works, and especially his works on freedom of the will and original sin. In this view of things, he thought it of importance that ministers should be very critical in examining candidates for the ministry with respect to their principles, as well as their religious dispositions and morals. and on that account he met with considerable difficulty and opposition in some instances. His opinion was that an erroneous or unfaithful minister was likely to do more hurt than good to the Church of Christ, and therefore he could not have any hand in introducing a man into the ministry unless he appeared sound in the faith and manifested to the judgment of charity a disposition to be faithful. End of chapter 3, having been read by Peter John Paresis. Were relinquished, he did not see where a man could set his foot